Combat is probably one of the most crucial and complicated elements of any game. It is core to how players are able to interact with the game and highly linked to the overall gameplay feel. There are also a tremendous number of possible combat systems available to choose from, each with their own unique benefits and setbacks, making it difficult to know which combat system is a good fit for a specific game. Finding the perfect fit can be the key to a game's overall success or failure when it comes to finally getting into the hands of players. To put it simply, the stakes are high when implementing such an important system. Today's video is about my own journey towards adding a combat system to my game. It begins with mana. This is a journey that I kicked off at the start of 2025 when I foolishly embarked on a mission to create my own dream game in Unity with almost no previous game dev experience. The journey has had its share of ups and downs, but so far I've been able to implement my player character, my first map, and some basic enemies. The natural next step is of course giving our player a way to interact with those enemies through combat. So that's what we'll be trying to do in today's episode. Now, I won't lie to you. We won't walk away from the end of this video with anything close to a fully fledged combat system, but we do make some serious progress towards this goal. Today's video will lay out the groundwork for our combat system in code, give our player their first weapon, have us implement attack animations that vary per swing, and even develop the functionality to layer slash animations with each attack. Really, we get right up to the point that we are ready to do damage to our enemies, which I believe is the perfect spot to start our next episode. Or at least that's what I'm telling myself, and in reality, I'm just terrified of the amount of coding that needs to be done to accomplish those next steps. We'll see. Before we get into the details of how the implementation of each of these systems went, I think it is important that we discuss what I want combat to look like in my game. As mentioned in the intro to this video, there are a lot of choices when it comes to combat, and I think it'll help you understand my decisions if you know what my end goal is for this system. So let's jump into our Obsidian notes real quick and take a high-level look at how combat, classes, and weapons will work in my game. We'll start with the combat section as it gives us the best overview in terms of what I'm trying to achieve. The overall goal of the combat system is to be simple, fun, and impactful. The game is a 2D side-scrolling RPG and will use action combat similar to games such as old-school MapleStory and more modern titles like Hollow Knight. Players will choose between classes from a branching class system, and each class will have a small selection of impactful skills or a kit, similar to games like Guild Wars 2 and League of Legends. I want to avoid button bloat that is frequently seen in games like World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV. Now, we won't get into the branching class system and class abilities in this video, despite the fact that I've spent way too long mapping out both of these systems, but instead we'll be focusing in on the absolute basics. Essentially, we will be working on implementing the player's basic attack with the most basic weapon, a stick, which is really just a one-handed sword, one of the fastest one-handed weapons in the outline for my current weapons system. Class abilities will typically have access to a few different weapon variants that will not change the ability itself per se, but will change factors such as attack speed, weapon damage, and attack range. The combat system we will be implementing in today's video is designed to have specific attacks attached to different weapon types, which I'm hoping will work well with the vision I have for this system. So, as with many of our previous devlog episodes, we began by watching a tutorial. As with the last few systems I've implemented, we will be continuing to use Barden's amazing 2D platformer controller playlist, focusing in on his multi-weapon combat system videos. I've said it before, but these are absolutely amazing tutorials. He takes both the time to explain the concept of the system itself and goes through the implementation at a beginner-friendly speed. Essentially, we are creating a system that allows us to build weapon types that can be equipped and unequipped by our player with different skills attached to each of the unique weapon types. We are implementing this by creating a weapons class that is called by a new player attack substate that is part of our existing player ability superstate. I've adjusted the player finite state machine diagram that we created last episode to show where this new player attack substate fits and visualize the connection it has to our weapons class. I haven't made a diagram of our weapons class yet, as we only have the one active weapon, but this might become necessary as the system becomes more complicated. Okay, so that was a lot of explaining, but where exactly do we start with all this? Well, my logic was that we can't attack if we don't have some sort of weapon, so I wanted to first and foremost give my player a weapon. This wasn't actually too hard to do, as I went back into our existing Procreate player file and created a simple stick weapon for our front-facing player rig. It didn't have to be perfect, as I knew there would be plenty of time to polish it later. Little did I know how soon I would be returning to these files to essentially rework my entire player asset, but we'll get into that later in this video. I did watch a quick Tarot Dev video about sprite swapping in Unity to learn a bit more about how new sprites could be added or swapped into existing rigs. We then proceeded to add our weapon to the existing PSB file for our player, and just like that, our stick was in the game. We had to do a significant amount of fiddling with this stick sprite to get it onto the proper sorting layer and connected to our existing rig, but eventually we could use our existing front-facing rig animations with our new weapon. With our weapon in hand, it was time to start making it actually usable. We started by creating our player attack substate and connecting it to the rest of our existing player finite state machine. We set this up with both a primary and secondary attack button to begin, however, we don't really get into the distinction of these two attacks in this video. We connected both attacks to our input handler and then provided the logic to our player grounded state and player in-air state, allowing us to transition into our player attack state when using our newly mapped controls. At this point, it just freezes us in the player attack state as there's nothing really going on in that script, but at least it's a start. Now it was time to start adjusting our game object hierarchy to make room for our new weapons class script. Conceptually, this is where the difficulty of the system really started for me, as we would be diverging slightly from Bardent's tutorial. See, Bardent is using sprite sheet animation, whereas we are using rig animations, and because of this, we can't set things up exactly as he has them in his tutorial. We navigated this by staying as close to the tutorial as possible, with a weapons game object, followed by a sword 1 game object, and lastly with a copy of our front-facing player rig to be used for our attack animations. This setup worked, but created a true abomination without any game object disabling being added to our existing animations. So I went through and disabled the duplicate version of our front-facing player rig, and now we could have the game run as it used to with our new weapons game objects being added. We added an animator controller to our new front-facing player sword rig game object, the copy of our front-facing player rig, and began making our attack animations. We made 3 unique attack animations for our sword so that we could add variety to our attack animations when players use multiple basic attacks in a row. I know I say this with like every new animation I have to make, but man, were attack animations a new level of pain to try and make look at least half decent. These were definitely animations where I felt that the rig style animation was holding me back in terms of how expressive each sword swing could be, but I knew the long-term benefits of rigging would pay off once we started introducing new gear for our player to wear in-game. The last attack animation we made for the sword was an empty animation. This essentially accomplishes the same thing we do in our overlapping animations, where we set an animation key to disable duplicate game object rigs, but instead disables the rig that the animation is using so that the animation is just a blank frame for us to use when we aren't attacking. In the animator controller, we set the default animation to this empty frame and then cycle through the sword attack animations 1, 2, and 3 when we are actively in combat. This is handled by having an attack bool that marks us in either combat or not in combat, and an integer that counts which attack animation we are on. With our animations and our animator controller set up, it was time to start coding the functionality of our weapon. To do this, we added a weapon script to our sword 1 game object. We connected our new animator controller to the script and built out our enter and exit functions that would control our attack bool, marking us as in combat in the enter function and out of combat in the exit function. We also built out the ability to set our active weapon in our player attack state with the use of a rudimentary inventory script that essentially just allowed us to access the sword weapon type. To be clear, this inventory system has no functionality outside of just letting us equip our sword, but for now it allows us to use our weapon, which is great. With all of these elements connected, it was time to test our weapon animations in-game, and of course, they didn't work. For the longest time, my player just kept disappearing when entering the player attack state, and I couldn't figure out why. I tried adjusting and debugging many different areas, but as it turned out, the issue was that I was disabling the game object that housed the sword animator controller instead of just disabling the front-facing player's sword rig that was used in the attack animations. Once this was adjusted in several animations, we had success. We could swing our weapon in-game and not disappear. We just couldn't stop swinging our weapon or swap between different swing animations yet, but at least this was something. We also continued moving while swinging our weapon, which was particularly fun to play around with. To escape from our own attacks, we needed to add animation finish trigger functions to our player attack ability state and weapon scripts. Now, one challenge we faced with this was that our weapon script is not actually on the same game object that our animations are playing from. So Barden had us create an intermediary script that relays the animation triggers from the game object with our animations to the game object with our weapon script. We then simply had to add the triggers to our attack animations, and just like that, we could now swing our sword and not get stuck in an endless cycle of swinging animations. We went on to add the counter that would move us through the 3 different attack animations in our weapon scripts. We got this working right away, which was nice. However, we now had to see my much uglier second and third attack animations, which wasn't so nice. We also added a new scriptable game object to store our weapon data. This is where we'll keep information about the weapon that can be pulled into our scripts as necessary. To begin, we'll be using this to store velocity values for each of the 3 attack animations for our weapon. These are applied via a function built into our player attack state script and called via triggers placed at specific moments in each animation, marking when the velocity should start being applied and stop being applied. It looks kind of silly with how slow my attack animations are, but it is nice to have this functionality available for future attacks. For now though, I just set the weapon attack velocities to 0. The last bit of polish that we added to our attack animations was the ability to flip horizontally at the very start and end of the attack animation. This is helpful as players sometimes hit buttons slightly off of what they're expecting, and it improves game feel by giving a bit of flexibility to turn the attack once it's started if you want to be facing a different direction. This functionality was also handled by animation triggers added at specific frames for each of the 3 attack animations. It was at this time that I decided to take a break from coding and add some polish to the player character assets. I'm not really sure what drove this desire, but I think opening the old Procreate files to create my stick awoke something in me, because before I knew it, I was recreating my player character sprite from scratch. I focused on improving the quality of the outlines, adding shading to the body, and even adding more detail to the face with the addition of facial hair and my newest take on what mana-forged eyes could look like. I'm still not 100% sold on the new eyes, but I shared them in a poll in our YouTube community section, and most people seem to be in favor of the new version. Please let me know your own preference between the 2 eye styles in the comments below. Oh, and because I redid the front-facing rig with all of these new details, I also felt like I had to redo the back-facing rig with the same details to match. So there we go, new assets for the entire player out of nowhere. But the fun didn't stop there. I then imported the new assets as PSB files into Unity and did our regular routine of rigging their bones, adding inverse kinematics, and prepping them for, you guessed it, all new animations. Were all of these steps, or really any of these steps, necessary at this point? No. But I was getting tired of the combat system implementation and felt like working on some more creative elements of the game. I'm also happy to report that I've now done the importing, rigging, and inverse kinematic steps enough times that I didn't need to look up the handy tutorial from TerraDev, which actually did feel like progress in terms of my overall coding knowledge base. Making new animations for everything and weaving them into our existing game object structure and scripts took a really long time, but I feel like the repetition of these steps further cemented my understanding of how many of these systems in my game actually work. This needed to be done with both the front and back-facing rigs, and the same attack animations that we made earlier in this episode were also remade with the new front-facing rig. I think I made the animations a bit better this time, but I'm still only somewhat happy with how they turned out. That said, at a certain point, you've got to leave things as good enough for now and come back to them later. I finally had absolutely every animation working with the new assets and was fairly happy with the overall improvement in visuals for the game. It actually made a fairly big difference when comparing them side by side. With that done, I started adding some final polish to the attacks before calling it a day for the episode. I first worked on stopping the player's movement when they entered the weapon script. This had the desired effect of stopping the player from being able to drift around while being locked in the attack animations, but stopped their velocity mid-air as well, which kind of felt weird. We improved this by bringing our if grounded check from our previous state scripts into our weapon script, and now we only stop velocity if the player was grounded. I then decided to add some swipe animations to our attack animations. I created the swipes in Procreate by building the animation with the player character sprite as a reference point. The swipes were then added as animations to a new game object named Sword Swipes that sits as a child of the Sword 1 game object. The same logic applied to both the game object and the script to make it so that the swipe animations are hidden in an empty layer until they are called and match the same attack animation based on our attack counter integer. As we created the swipe animations independently of the already created attack animations, we needed to try and match the timing of both animations to work as well as possible. For future attacks, it'll probably make more sense to create the attack swipe animation first and then animate the attack in Unity to match up as closely as possible to the swipe animations. Lastly, we adjusted the order and layer for our swipe animations to have them sit just underneath our weapon sprite, and voila, we had attack animations with swipes. Are they amazingly accurate to the animations? No. But I believe they'll help us illustrate the hitbox for the attacks in our next episode, where we start making it so that our attacks can actually do something to our enemies. Either way, I'm happy I took the time to implement the functionality to add swipes and other effects to our attacks, as this will be important as we start working on our more flashy skills. And this is finally where I decided to stop for this episode. I know we don't have a fully implemented combat system, but I feel like we actually made a lot of progress towards this goal. Did I waste a bit of time revamping assets that didn't need to be adjusted and will probably be reworked again in the future? Absolutely. Do I regret this? No, not really. I'm still really inspired when working on this project, and I think one of the main reasons for this is that I have the freedom to work on whatever interests me at the time. So even though it wasn't pushing my immediate goal forward, I think stopping to work on things like this is what will keep me from getting burnt out in the long run. Kind of stopping to smell the roses while working towards completing the next step in a very long journey. With that, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I appreciate you taking the time to stop by and watch. If you haven't, please consider liking the video and subscribing to follow along with the rest of our journey. I'd love to see you in the next video. Thanks.